I'm going to prep some handles, and this is actually the piece of clay that I cut off of the edge of my slab. And generally I do this in the studio. It just seems like it's about the right amount of clay for pulling handles. So I'm going to start out and stretch this piece of clay, and I think of it as kind of a fat carrot. And I'm doing this in a similar way to how I stretched the slab. And then I usually make it slightly fatter in one direction. For my handles, I like to have sort of a dog bone bow tie shape handle where it's fat at the bottom and at the top. It gives you a nice place to grab onto with your fingers in that thinner area in the middle. And it took me a really long time to figure out how to pull these handles. My hands just couldn't figure out how to do it. But the trick is that on your very first move, you have to sort of make a pull and then stop short. And then continue to do that throughout as you're pulling your handle. So you kind of, instead of making a nice long smooth pull like you would to make a handle that's thick to thin throughout, you're putting more of your pressure in the center as you're pulling, and then easing off as you get down towards the bottom. And then once I've got that general shape, I'll start to think about how wide I want it, how skinny I want it, and pull accordingly. So now I'm thinning out the center just a bit. And then starting to think about the curve. And then once I think I have it to a nice thickness, something that feels good in my hand, I will lay it over the edge of the table. And then when I cut it off, I cut it at a diagonal from me down towards the table. And what happens when I do that is it gives this handle a really nice spring up off of the surface that it's hooked onto. And I allow my handles to set up for usually about an hour before I attach them to the piece. It allows the piece to not be as sticky on the outside. And so I don't make fingerprints and mar the surface of the handle. So it looks really smooth and delicate as it attaches onto the piece. I pulled handles for this box earlier, so they've had a chance to set up. They don't have as much slurry on the outside. It started to absorb into the clay. And I pulled the same dog bone shape that we pulled for the mug, where it's fat at the top and at the bottom. And you'll notice that the top where I cut it off of my lug of clay is wider than the bottom, and the bottom is fat. So since I want the left and right to be symmetrical, I need to take this and change its shape. So by using the heel of my hand, I'll gently press out both ends so that they match. And it's the same thickness throughout. Now I can take the handle, clean up anywhere it might have stuck to the table, and figure out how I need to cut the ends so that they'll fit onto the butter box. Sometimes when I pull these, they'll be really high and look a little strange on top of the butter box. You want enough room for your fingers to get underneath, but not so much that the handle seems very outrageous. So I think that curve looks good. It's sort of like a little purse bag. And then to fit on top of these little bumps, I will cut the handle with a little concave curve on each end. And then since the handle comes off of the piece at an angle, so I'm going to cut out the interior corner at the end of the handle, and then round out all of my cut lines so they're a little bit more organic. Now I'll slip and score both the top of the butter box and my handle. Score the box and then attach the handle. And I'm firmly pressing these two parts together. And then clean up the seam. When I glaze this piece, I will glaze the handle and then this area, but leave this slab raw clay so it mimics the bottom of the butter box. Now this handle looks a little less frilly than the rest of the pot. So to get it to have a similar tone as everything else. I have pulled two handles that are just a straight tapered small handle. They're slightly narrower than the dog bone shaped handle that I pulled already. And because they're a little bit narrower, they tend to dry out quicker than the middle bottom piece. So I'll just add a little bit of moisture so that I can curve them. And I'm actually going to end up with 3 handles on this box, but they'll be layered on top of each other so that they form one piece. I'm going to cut the ends into a nice little curve. I'm cutting at an angle from the top, and then once I peel that piece off, I'll cut the messy part off on the back. And do the same with the second. And then round out all of those corners. Now that I've got nice rounded edges, I'll lay one on the left and one on the right, with the excess coming out in the center, and made sure that where they meet up lines up with the center of the lid and the center of the base. Now I'm going to cut these off at the same time, and I cut just a little arch on top, and then I'll make a little curlicue with that extra. And then I'm also going to make kind of a keystone that fits in between those two handles. And I always use part of the clay that I cut off from the top because it's the same wetness as the handle, so it won't crack apart as it dries, since they'll be drying in the same way. So I just rolled that into a little teardrop shape. And now I just remove one handle at a time, and that way I can use the second handle as an indicator of where this one needs to attach and where the middle is. And I cleaned up the cut edge, and now gently I'll roll that into a little finial, and then slip and score the back side of both handles, and press the two parts together. It's good to have a little bit of extra slip between the two handles so that it starts to ooze out the seam. It helps them stay stuck together really well. And then I'll go back and clean up the excess with a paintbrush. Now that I've got the first side on, we'll do the second. And stick the two together. So by curling over those edges, I now have a gap in the middle, and that's what we'll use that little teardrop ball for. Add just a tiny bit of slip, both parts. And fit that little ball down into the gap. Last but not least, clean up the mess. It's also a good idea to make sure that that center ball is actually standing up straight. If I'm not paying attention, sometimes it'll be off to the left or the right, and I won't realize until it's bone dry, and then it's too bad. There's no way to fix it. So now's a good time to catch details like that.